Hey there, first readers. Easter is a strange season in the lectionary for us over here at the Old Testament Lectionary Podcast because during Easter, the first reading is drawn from the New Testament book of Acts. So this year, we've decided to use this season to re-release some of our favorite episodes from the First Reading Vault, conversations with leading scholars in the field. This week, since we just passed the Jewish holiday of Purim, we're featuring our 2021 interview with Rosy Kandathil, who, not long after this interview, became one of our regular hosts. Our conversation is centered around the book of Esther, which happens to be the topic of Rosy's PhD dissertation, which she's defending this week. Go, Rosy! So, enjoy this best of First Reading episode. Welcome to First Reading, the Old Testament Lectionary Podcast that gives you the tools you need to preach with confidence from the Hebrew Bible. I'm Tim McNinch, a PhD candidate at Emory University.
And I'm Dr. Rachel Wren, Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies at Trinity Lutheran Seminary. The first reading for September 26, 2021 is a series of excerpts from chapters 7 and 9 of the book of Esther, which is fantastic because Esther is a great book, but is kind of too bad at the same time because this is the only time in the whole lectionary cycle that we get Esther read at all. So we wanted to take a deeper dive into this awesome little book. So we reached out to one of our colleagues for some additional expertise.
That's right. We've invited Rosy Kandathil to join us today. Rosy is a fellow PhD candidate in Hebrew Bible at Emory University and is in the process of writing a dissertation on the book of Esther, looking especially into the strange collision of humor and violence within this story. Now, since she's one of the brightest people we know and becoming a world expert on the book of Esther, we couldn't pass up the opportunity to chat with her about understanding and preaching from this book. So, Rosy Kandathil, welcome to First Reading.
Thank you all for having me. I'm excited for this conversation. We're so glad to have you here. To start us off, obviously biblical scholarship and preaching, neither of those things happen in a vacuum. And there is so much going on right now around us, including a pandemic that has, fundamentally changed life around the world for about a year and a half. So how have you managed pandemic life? Like just personally, what's been your coping strategy for the past 18 months?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I try to avoid the news, like the news cycle. The other thing is that I had a baby, my first child.
That's right.
In March of 2020, just as the pandemic opened up. And so it's a weird coping mechanism to have a little life to be caring for, but she helps me, kind of focus on the important things and instead of, kind of all the anxieties that are swarming around. She's a real, as you both know from your kids, they focus you in ways that like almost nothing else can.
That's right.
Yeah. They care that nothing else is going on except what is happening in their little world, which can be really refreshing.
And Rosy, biblical studies isn't your first career. Can you tell us a little bit about how you found your way into this field?
Yeah, I've taken a meandering path, to say the least. So I started out actually in law, and I was a practicing attorney in New York for 7 years before I took a sabbatical. And during that sabbatical, I lived at a monastery and took spiritual direction for a while. And it was actually from my experience at the monastery that I started taking some theology classes and realizing that I really enjoyed scripture and started going in a totally different direction. So that's kind of how I got here in a nutshell. My specialty in law was in criminal defense. I was a public defender in New York. So interesting intersections all the time with the biblical scriptures and my experience of practicing law in the United States.
Well, maybe every biblical scholar should start out as a lawyer because it's really worked well for the work that you're doing.
Absolutely.
So,
it's an expensive route. That's all I have to say.
Well, awesome. We are so excited to dig into this text with you. The lectionary this week gives us some of the climax of the story of Esther from chapter 7, verses 1 through 6 and 9 through 10, and then in chapter 9, verses 20 to 22. Rosy, could you read that for us in English? And you feel free to fill in some of those verses in the middle, too, if that helps.
Sure. So I am reading from the New Revised Standard Version, and I'm starting here with Esther chapter 7, verse 1. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman off to the banquet that Esther had prepared. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, as they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me. That is my petition. And the lives of my people. That is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace. But no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king." Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he? Who has presumed to do this?" Esther said, "A foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. The king rose from the feast in wrath and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that the king had determined to destroy him. When the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman had thrown himself on the couch where Esther was reclining. And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" As the words left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Look, the very gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, stands at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the anger of the king abated. And now I'll go to chapter 9, verses 20 through 22. Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, enjoining them that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar and also the 15th day of the same month year by year, as the days on which the Jews gained relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and presents to the poor.
Wow, what an exciting climax to the story. But before we go anywhere else, can we try to just summarize the rest of the story? If you can, Rosie, could you try the 1 minute, the elevator speech for the book of Esther, as far as just what's the plot of the story?
Right. The story, can be summarized pretty quickly. It's got a great kind of straight plot line, and our reading kind of brings us right into the middle of things, right? So the story begins set in Persia, in the kind of opulent luxury of this king Ahasuerus, right? And the text begins kind of laying out the wonder and splendor of this kingdom. And he opens with a feast that he gets pretty drunk and happy at, and requests the appearance of Queen Vashti. And when she refuses to come at his command, he decides to depose her. And that provides the opening for a beauty contest in which all the beautiful young women of the kingdom of Persia are invited to compete. Dragged to compete. Esther falls within this dragnet and wins the favor of the king and everyone who sees her, including all the eunuchs that are attending her, and somehow, then gets elevated to Queen of Persia. In the meantime, another very powerful Haman, vizier or courtier or just a court advisor, rises to power as well and gets into a quarrel with her cousin Mordecai, who refuses to bow or do honor to Haman when he's raised to that position. So that's kind of happening in the background. And Haman manages to convince the king that the Jewish people, without actually saying that they're the Jewish people, are a threat to the kingdom. And so an edict is issued for the destruction of the Jewish people. Esther's informed by her cousin that if she doesn't do something about this, her people will be destroyed. And Esther decides to do something. And so she goes against the law and decides that she will go to the king despite the consequences which she cites, which is death, if you appear before the king without his exact command. Mm-hmm. So she kind of sets up these banquets, these scenes that she invites Haman to. And we're not really sure as the reader why, until this banquet scene that we get to in chapter 7, where that becomes revealed. And she reels in the king and Haman into this moment where she reveals who she really is, that she's actually Jewish and she's been hiding her identity, and that this edict would include her and everyone in her family. And that is what sets the scene for what we begin here, the second banquet where she makes her large revelation.
Well done.
Well, yeah, exactly. Okay. So the ancient setting is in Persia. Do we have any idea when it was written or where it was written? If the place that it was set in is actually kind of the place it was written? Do we have any ideas about that?
So there's a lot of dispute, but one good thing about Esther in terms of we have some clear markers where we might not always have in the biblical text. That kind of give us some potential endpoints and beginning points. So most scholars put this text somewhere between 400 BC and 200 BC. And the reasons for that is because, as you said, the setting is in Persia. And it seems as though the author is pretty familiar with some details of Persia, including some sort of internal details, like where the palace would be, how the administration works, how eunuchs work, so there's that. And so there's some sense that, but in order for a reader to really be able to appreciate those details or that those would even matter, most scholars think it's got to have some crossover to about the end of the Persian Empire, which is taking place about 330 BC. So that's kind of the reason for the maybe around 400, somewhere around there. And then the later point of between 400 and 200 BC, that later point is there because we have the Septuagint, which is dated to right around there, the Greek Esther, which is canonical in some versions of the Bible. Mm-hmm. There are other also indications in the Hebrew. So one thing to note is that the Hebrew here is considered late biblical Hebrew with connections to the Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah. So we've kind of got that setting in time.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and then more broadly, too, the book of Esther itself has taken a particular role in Jewish history. Can you talk about that a little bit, about the role that Esther has played?
Okay, so let's talk perhaps about Purim, if that's what you mean, the festival itself, and how that began, and whether or not Esther should be seen as an etiology, an explanation really for that festival. Because the book as a whole reads as kind of the background for, why do we celebrate Purim? And this is the story we read to remind ourselves of what God's not mentioned in this text, but yes, which is an important thing to note. Yeah. But, the survival of the Jewish people through this very serious threat. The book itself has this sacred place in the sort of festival scrolls, of which there are 5. They're all read at particular festival points. And that's where Esther kind of, for some people, that's the reason why it's here. There are other ways to talk about Jewish history here too, which, maybe I'll just kind of say a little bit about as well. The fact that this is in a diaspora setting, right? And there are other stories in the biblical text, including Daniel 1-6, and maybe you put Tobit in this one as well, the apocryphal book, are these stories of Jews that are set outside of the homeland. Yeah. And these books in particular address the kind of fears or even guidance on how to live in that less rooted maybe circumstance without homeland. And, you see some of the traces of that with language here as well, and how to navigate the complexity of not having power.
No, I think that's a really helpful thing to say. It could even possibly be a preaching point. This concept of diaspora is where the support that you've relied on and you've taken for granted your entire life is suspended. And you have to live in sort of a different set of rules and a different scenario and figure out how to thrive in the midst of that. which I think 18 months into COVID is still, I mean, I think we're still kind of in a diaspora situation where the typical support, the typical rules have been suspended, and we're trying to find our way, still trying to figure out how to thrive and not just survive in this place where it's kind of like a foreign land almost.
Yeah, and it's also especially relevant for congregations and congregants who themselves are living in a diasporic situation as immigrants or refugees, or first, second, or third generation folks from other places. That the particular sort of cultural impact of a story like this really resonates with those communities and makes it the kind of story that you wish would come up more often than just this in the lectionary.
Amen.
That's exactly, I mean, that's one really great pitching point. It has always stood out to me about Esther is how she navigates that new reality and how she then, chooses to reveal her identity, right? So I might self-identify as a child of immigrants, and so I'm an Indian American. And so I recognize some of the ways that she speaks, to power, like kind of in this very deferential, kind of humble way, and it cleverly kind of draws out on different ways to be able to gather favor to herself before actually asking for something, right? So there's a lot there for, I think, for immigrants to just recognize as well in their own life, the kind of code switching that's going on as she, talks to Mordecai in one way. But then, in the court, you can see her formality, the way that if it pleases the king, I want to make this request or in this petition, right? There's a formality to her dress. She gets, there's a very involved sections of how she prepares for these banquets too. There's a lot for immigrants to self-reflect on their own, I don't know, the struggle to belong and with which community to identify, right? So Esther faces a struggle. Should she identify? And she has a choice, it looks like, and not every immigrant does, whether to make that alliance or not, to make that obvious. Yeah. Is she, and that, I think about my queer brothers and sisters too, is like, is that something, that identity can put you in some danger in the church, right? Yeah. But this story offers some comfort in the coming out and the value of coming out, of identifying yourself with a community that might be facing persecution, and in some way also advocating for them, right? So as the lawyer part of me sees the choice that she makes to stand with a marginalized, suffering community at that point and say, I belong to this group, and if you don't do something, I am going to die with them, right? And so she chooses at that point to identify herself and fall under the same, the punishment that edict would have included her at that point.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Yeah, there's so much stuff going on here with just like...
Dear listeners, you couldn't see it, but Tim just covered his face almost in despair of how are we going to get to all this fantastic things? Go ahead. Sorry, Tim.
No, it's great. I mean, the theme of like, the way that she like passes for a non-Jew within the Persian power structure and then has to, make a decision to take on this public identity as a minoritized person. And just all of the power dynamics and sexual exploitation that happens in this story. There's the character of Vashti and her sort of like badass character in the story. There's just so much going on in this very, relatively short book. One thing I wanted to bring up, Rosy, you made reference to this, that, and this is getting a bit into the weeds, but there's a Hebrew tradition of this book, and there's also a Greek Septuagint tradition of the book, and they're not exactly the same. If there's one thing that people may have heard about of the book of Esther, it's that it's the one book in the Bible that doesn't mention God. And I think, if I remember right, that's true in the Hebrew Masoretic tradition, but not necessarily in the Greek tradition.
Oh.
Well, what do you want to say about that? If there's anything that would be helpful, I'm trying to put myself in the place of a preacher preparing a sermon for this and wondering, does it matter to me that there are different traditions of this book?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to recognize is the purposeful ambiguity of the presence of God in the Hebrew text, right? It's one reason why, even there was a struggle to see the Hebrew Esther as part of this canon, right? So it obscures the presence of God in a way that I think is powerful, particularly in the diaspora. And if we think about people that are in the midst of struggle, where it's a challenge sometimes to see God at work. And so this book really kind of speaks to invisibility of God and the question of human agency under those circumstances. But as you said, the Greek fixes that problem. God is explicit in this Septuagint. By the time it's translated into the Greek, what we find is that community needed to have God explicit in this narrative tradition, right? And includes also then because the question of, how are Esther and Mordecai Jewish? In what ways do they show any, loyalty? It's different from Daniel, right? Daniel is clearly, even the diaspora story, Daniel and his friends are oriented toward the homeland in a way that really kind of exemplifies their loyalty to that primary place. Whereas for Esther, the homeland's not mentioned at all. It's not an option. She's not oriented toward the homeland. She's oriented toward her people. And that is really kind of an interesting tension to work with, as well as, she doesn't have a place to run to. This is home. Right. So, for those, DACA recipients or whatever, there's no going back. Yeah. This is it, and so you have to find a way to get through. But this Septuagint, at least, makes both Mordecai and Esther much more pious and devoted. Esther reflects on the difficulty of being Jewish in this setting, of having to hide her identity, of having to sleep with a king that's foreign and uncircumcised. So all these markers of Jewish identity become much clearer in the Septuagint, which indicates to me that this is a point of tension: is how do we define ourselves in diaspora? Are we comfortable with this more maybe assimilated or ambiguous portrait that the Hebrew Esther produces of, the Jewish people that are both able to get along, almost disappear, and yet still elicit a significant amount of hatred if the book is to be believed? So what is it that they're doing that makes them stand out in that way? And yet in the Greek, that is much more clear of where both Mordecai and Esther find tension in living in a foreign land among foreign people with unclean lips.
That's so powerful. I just feel like I'm just sort of soaking it in. I mean, everything from this idea of, the purposeful invisibility of God. Can you say some more about that? Why do you think that God was kept at a distance or at an arm's length in this book?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think, and for preachers too, it's worth really wrestling with this, because I think a lot of congregants struggle with seeing God in their daily lives. And I think the way that Esther communicates, and it's a choice to see God at work. I mean, certainly the author gives you enough clues that, the circumstances seem to work out so well, right? And Esther garners this approval and love wherever she goes. And it seems with very little effort. She's not doing anything to gain that. And it seems as though God's grace and favor follow her in ways that, that we can't really see clearly. And there's something really powerful about that. And I think many congregants might recognize that from their own lives, is that there are, although I can't see God clearly in my daily circumstance, it's not like God has spoken to me as in other areas of the Hebrew Bible where we, hear the voice of God speaking to the hero. Yeah. We don't get that. We get a Mordecai who's also kind of a faltering figure in ways. He's the one that challenges Esther. You've got to do something. Do you think you rose to this position, out of nowhere? Yeah. And it seems to occur to Esther at that point, well, maybe I do need to do something, and that feels very close to what a lot of people in real life go through, which is, maybe I'm here for a reason.
Yeah.
And maybe there's something I'm supposed to do. And, I'm going to try. And that's exactly what Esther says. If I perish, I perish. I'm going to try. And so there's something really powerful, I think, for people who recognize in their own circumstance, they don't hear the clear voice of God to go do X, Y, but in some way are struggling to figure out, what can I do to honor, who I am, who I want to be, the people to whom I belong and love, I want to see thrive and flourish. And so who is my community, and how will I do something to help, whether or not God condemns me to death at that point, or I just, I fall victim to the law at this point, she makes a choice to stand and to try.
The absence of God in this book could be sort of a scandalous thing, but in a way that's what makes it so relatable.
Yeah,
that it's for most of us, this is our experience of God in the world as a kind of hidden presence that takes, discernment to recognize.
Yeah.
Well, we're having such a great time talking about these, big picture things that are going on in this fascinating book. We should take a few minutes at least to talk about some of the particulars of the lectionary text, to give people something to really work with exegetically in this particular passage at the climax of the story.
Yeah, I mean, let's dive in. There's so many things to talk about. First of all, I think that your discussion of code switching, and just in case we have any listeners that's a new term for, could you define the term code switching before I ask my next question about the text?
So I'll just use my own example as an Indian American, right? So with my family, I can use Malayalam, like our home language, or some mix of that in English. But when I am in my academic setting, I need to use a formal kind of English in order to be understood, in order to be respected, in order to be just kind of, So there's a switch that's going on depending on who I'm with, in order to be able to communicate belonging in that group. And so, and that was kind of, that phenomenon is something that I'm referring to here in Esther as well, is that we see not only in the way that this character navigates the different situations that she's in, but also in the linguistic, the kind of, I don't know how much your preachers want to get into this, but there are Aramaic and Persian loanwords that are in this text, which indicate that whoever this author is and the reading community is that they are also quite able to move between cultures. So they can understand these Persian words, they can understand these Aramaic words, they can understand this Hebrew. And so this is a community that is multilingual, multicultural, in ways that, just, it's hard to, without more time, to kind of really get into the impact of that, reading through the Hebrew and seeing these Persian words coming up. And it's very recognizable to an immigrant who will translate, and sort of, I can tell you something in Malayalam and then there'll be an English word in it, like, or Spanglish, for instance, like something like that, that's what you're kind of seeing in this text a little bit more.
Well, and I think that makes so much sense, because as I was reading verses 2 and 3, all of a sudden I was like, oh my gosh, they're speaking in Hebrew poetry. It's A and then B, and then what's more A and what's more B. So the king starts it by talking about petition, it shall be granted, request, it shall be fulfilled. Like, that is classic Hebrew poetry. Yeah, it's parallelism. Yes. And Esther responds back. If I've won your favor, O king, and if it pleases, let my life be given to me. That is my petition. Analyze my people. That is my request. She responds in parallelism. So is that an example of the code switching you're talking about?
That is too. Yeah. And so there's certain formalities that she's learned. Yeah. That this is how we communicate. Right. I mean, it's just powerful to me. I mean, in court, there's certain language that you have to use, like, may it please the court. Right. That's not what you use in the normal world. But if you are in court, that's how you begin. Yeah. That's how you start. Or, my client X, that's in normal, in a normal world, you don't use those phrases. So it's to me, it's a signal of how well she navigates these very fraught situations.
Well, and if I understand code switching correctly too, it's the fact that if you use the wrong code in the wrong scenario, you will be rejected as well. So it's not just that you can communicate well, but that one code means belonging here which would mean rejection over here.
And if you think about that metaphorically for this book too, like how did this book make it into the canon?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
How did it communicate to its readers that it belonged?
Yeah, right.
Like,
it code switched to believers.
It code switched to this community enough to prove that it belonged.
Oh, I love that.
Even though it sits in challenge
Yeah.
in many other portions of the Hebrew Bible, which is, just amazing to me, the openness and the closeness of this canon, like that it's here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We're getting there bit by bit, and I think we just need to jump into it. And that's the violence in this book, and especially in the sort of climactic moments that we read for the lectionary text. So all the way sort of to the end of the part that we read in chapter 7, we're supposed to get to this point and celebrate, like, yay, Haman gets hung.
Right.
And that there's something that feels just a little off kilter for that, especially like in preaching a text like this in church. Like, what do you make of this violence? And then just to tag on to that as we get into chapter 9 and the way that the story ends up playing out, that rather than like rescinding the edict of the destruction of the Jews, the king just piles on another one that says, when people come to kill you, you kill them. And so there's this like big slaughter of those who were setting out to attack the Jews. And this becomes the impetus for the celebration, the annual celebration of Purim, where the Jewish people would look back and say, this is when we got to kill all our enemies. Yay! So all of that is set up. Like, what do we do with this? And like, how could we preach this type of violent text?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm writing a dissertation on this, so it's a huge topic on like how is violence handled in this text and how do we celebrate it, right? And I think, for preachers at least to be thinking about the Hebrew Bible is full of violence, right? So let's just put that out there. And this is certainly not the only text in which violence is related and celebrated. One thing to note here is the humor, right? So even as you're relating this story, we're laughing, right? And so there is something joyful in this story about the death of 75,000, which is the number that's cited in chapter 8, verse 17, Whoa. Right? Yeah, right. Okay, so that number too, right? 75,000 should give anyone pause, which is like the COVID numbers are like, like it's hard to stomach that number. And so, lots of interpreters will say the way to go about that is to just recognize that this is exaggeration. This is fantasy. And that there's a place maybe for revenge fantasy in this text. And we see this elsewhere in the Psalms as well, with the fantasy of being able to just slaughter your enemy and just have done with it, and there's something to be said about acknowledging the human condition and the sense that our own weakness and victimhood can lead us to the same cycles of violence that brought us to that initial place, right? So human experience tells us that victims of violence are often also perpetrators of violence, or abusers as well. For victims of sexual exploitation, as you mentioned in this text, I think Esther has something to say about that as well. It's like, how do we process trauma? And Esther can be read as a response to deep trauma. So there's fear that's in this text of being eliminated, of being annihilated in the most awful way by neighbors, by civilians, by shopkeepers. This is not an army. It's not the Persian army that they're afraid of. They're afraid of their neighbor turning against them and killing them. And so there's something in this text, to me, is very psychologically provocative and truthful about our own fears when unaddressed. And so if preachers want to talk about that and about how the cycles of violence often continue and get perpetrated in each generation. So one thing that I would suggest too is that the rereading of Esther, the Purim festival, offers an opportunity to reflect on the strategy of violence. Is this really there is probably a natural inclination to want to avenge ourselves, in these kinds of situations. But there are other options, and so that's one thing that I think the reenactment of Purim every year offers if a community can hear. And I think they can, because there are a number of folks who voice discomfort in the celebration of this text, right? So our communities are not blind to the mixed effect of violent resolution, right? And we can see that even in our own protest movements today. Is there's always going to be a group that will say violence needs to be at least on the table, and then there's another group that says nonviolence is the way of God, and so that is in this text as well. Like there's a question here on whether or not this is effective, because obviously it doesn't silence the threat to the Jews. Like they are threatened in each generation. That threat doesn't go away. Obviously, they weren't able to eliminate all their enemies, although this text talks about it. It's a scene that repeats itself over and over and over again with every one of our wars. So, I mean, to me, at least, it's the text offers an opportunity to host some of those hard questions for communities that are politically active, socially active. What are the strategies that we choose to use? What did they yield for us? How do they reflect our values? And what do we celebrate?
I think that's a really helpful hermeneutic strategy in general of approaching a text as a kind of conversation starter, as something that can raise some issues that we have to think about carefully and work through together, and then take personal responsibility for our decisions about that. We can't just pass off our our own sense of moral responsibility onto the text. We have to evaluate this, and it brings up these issues in a way that is really powerful because it is a sacred text.
And so prayer is probably a pretty big aspect of that too, praying on these questions. So it not only hosts these scriptures, not only host the questions, they invite us into conversation with God about these questions too.
Right. Yeah. And especially there too is it God that licenses this violence, that celebrates it with them? Or is the absence of God in some necessary for this kind of celebration on some way to say, this is what happens when we take matters into our own hands? There's a heap of 75,000 bodies. And I guess now an edict that says we can celebrate this every year. Right. But I mean, what's the fruit of our actions at the end? So it might be a celebration this year, but what happens a month from now? What happens 2 months from now? So there's a lot here that the text can offer in terms of just, providing the jumping off point for some of these communities too that are struggling with political polarization. Now, every congregation that I know right now is having a hard time with words. How do we even talk to each other? Before we resort to, painting each other with this very broad brush of being an enemy, of being an absolute enemy, because that is part of what's necessary in this text. You cannot see the faces of these enemies. They're just enemies. It's not painted with any more detail. Haman is just, we don't even know why. What's the animus? And that is because there's never been a conversation. There's never been any, detail. It's not, and that's something that maybe as congregation we need to think about too, is the resort to just calling someone a hated enemy precludes, any curiosity about where that might have come from. What is it that gave offense? How do we live together as neighbors, without being at each other's throats?
Wow, absolutely.
Those are such great prompts for conversation. And it's one of the things that, even though we're hosting a preaching podcast, right? It's one of the limitations of the sermon format that it's mostly a one-way, oration. And I hope that for those of you out there that are going to be picking up Esther and using it in your service, that you'll provide spaces for the kinds of conversations around the issues that this book raises for us to work through and process through together. But in the sermon context, one of the sort of homiletical things that I do when I'm preaching from a difficult text like this is especially when the reading of the text is a part of the liturgy, which I hope it is for all of you out there. I love to read a text like this and then let it sit for a moment and ask the congregation to reflect. As we were hearing the text, where did you feel like celebratory? Where did you feel a little twinge of, I don't know about that?
Yeah.
And can our sort of gut responses to the text also be an indicator of where there are things to work through and evaluate and process? I think that's a good like sort of first way into helping people to wrestle with a text, especially in contexts where people are trained to just take the scripture as being like, well, since it's the word of God, whatever it says, I've just got to sort of like swallow and
slaughter my neighbor. Slaughter my neighbor.
Yeah. So providing a prompt for a congregation to start to, like, let's ask those questions. Let's work through that together. And then in the sermon, you can begin that. But there needs to be more spaces than the sermon for working through a text like this.
Yeah, I think I would build on that, not necessarily the preaching question, but, well, it is still a preaching question because it's a preaching podcast. But this idea of, the festival of Purim. So that's, if you're not familiar with it, preachers, it's Purim, the festival of Purim. You can look it up and kind of read a little bit more about it. I would caution, I think the preaching pitfall that lends itself to this question of our Jewish siblings is not necessarily demonizing the festival that is lifted up in this book. We've talked about it, about how it's the festival of remembrance of a slaughter. And if it is presented only in that way in your sermon, it's going to leave your people with this understanding of like, wow, Jews are really weird people who celebrate really weird things. And that's not, I think, where we want to lead our parishioners. So here's my thought.
Let's say it's stronger than that. Don't do that.
Don't do that.
Don't do that.
So don't do that, A. And here's my thought, B. If you are going to talk about the festival, flesh it out before you do that. Give it an example of Purim. Give it a very fleshed out understanding of the modern festival of Purim, and then talk about how it relates to this book. If you're not going to give that space or time to do that, I would touch lightly on the festival aspect, because if so, you could accidentally lead people into a misunderstanding of our Jewish siblings that we definitely don't want them to have. Well, I think that leads, into just sort of specifically preaching the text. We've talked a lot about the big questions of what to do, what not to do, but did any angles come up for both of you, either of you, on how one might preach this text?
I mean, I was really struck by the theme of identity in the story, and as it plays out, especially in Esther's own sort of journey through the text. For me, as a white male person, what struck me was the decision that Esther had to make about whether to pass along with the powerful and remain silent, or whether to really take on a role of solidarity with her people in the plight that they were facing. And for me, as a white male person, somebody with privilege in our society, it's not so much about showing solidarity with my people as much as it is about allyship with minoritized communities or communities that are on the margins. And so it's a little bit of a leap, but I think there's a way to preach a text like this. If your congregation is a majority congregation, what's the choice that we make? Do we make the choice to remain silent in the presence of the injustices that are happening in our world? Or do we decide, following the example of Esther, to take on the role of allyship, even though that's going to involve risk for us? That's the beginning of a thought that I think could spin out into a helpful sermon for folks that are in a privileged context. I think there's another angle that would spin that out in a different way if your congregation is among the marginalized or minoritized. But that's where it hit me from my own context. What about you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I the identity issue always stands out to me just because there are, I think, rarely texts that offer the opportunity to really talk about multiple identities and multiple belongings. And that seems to me a really, really important thing to talk about in terms of also recognizing our interrelatedness to one another and the intersections that Esther occupies as both a queen, so somebody who is elite and powerful, but also someone who, has multiple belongings as someone who's a woman, someone who's been sexually exploited, someone who is Jewish, someone who has been orphaned, so she suffers multiple levels to me of identities that could be considered, difficult challenges to live through. And then, also enjoys the privileges of being queen, of having her own servants, of having some of her immediate needs taken care of, very, very quickly, and the favor of the king. So, just to recognize that our own identities are intersectional, that seems like, how rare is it that we can find a text in which we can offer our congregations ways to reflect on both power and powerlessness in our own lives and ways that we've experienced oppressions and ways that we have oppressed others.
Nice.
This text allows them a multiplicity of both confessing our involvement in violence and victimizing others, and then also accepting that we have also experienced pain and victimhood as well in different ways. And to be with that is a powerful preaching point for me. And Esther has always provided a way for me to be in touch with both sides of that in my own life. I have areas of privilege in which, I work in, and they need to be also consciously brought to mind. To only occupy the place of victim, is diminishing of who I am. And so that's important as we think about the complexities of how we navigate relationship, because that's ultimately what we're in church for, why we're listening to a sermon, right? We're here to be in relationship with one another and with a divine presence, so however we understand that. And to embrace identity too hard, I think precludes some of that.
Yeah, I have 15 things that I wrote down for sermon angles, so I won't say all of them. Okay, a couple things to throw out there. First, I love this idea of the purposeful invisibility of God in the book of Esther. I think that's powerful. I think that you choose to experience the voice of God, even if that voice comes through community or through silence. There is no guarantee that it's God. There's no proof. And yet you choose to continue to operate in that sphere. I just think that's a beautiful, beautiful invitation to parishioners who might be longing for that, but be afraid of feeling silly about it or feeling, insecure about, well, how do you act that way when it's easier just to come to church and then leave? So introducing that concept and that courage of choosing to see God at work, I think, even if God is invisible, is really powerful. And then I just love this idea of hosting the questions about violence and about words and about relationship and using your sermon to do that. So I come from a Lutheran tradition, which is, sermons are proclamation, and you're supposed to preach and you're supposed to proclaim the gospel. And that is what you are supposed to do, full stop, in many Lutheran circles. And that's typically how I preach. But on this one, man, I would sit in the questions. If you're going to take that route, just lean into it. How do we live together as neighbors? Leave your people with questions. That might be a different kind of proclamation than you're used to doing if you're Lutheran and you're listening to this. But I think it could be really powerful. And I think Esther, as a book, refuses to answer many questions. And this week, a faithful sermon on Esther might also refuse to answer some of those questions. So that's just kind of where I am leaning.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I love that because I think the questions too, ask for us to grow up.
Yeah.
There's a way that I come to church and, I might hope that my pastor tells me what to do.
Yeah.
But you're right. Esther refuses to give you clear direction on what to do. And that is an important part of being an adult of faith,
Right. Because so often God refuses to do the same thing. God refuses to give super clear divine instructions on where you're supposed to go left or right. So,
right. And if you're expecting that too, that the direction will always be clear, you will be paralyzed, I think. At least that's been my experience, is if I want that clear, should I do this? Should I do that? from God, it often comes in much more subtle ways. And Esther is clearly a reflection of that as well, is that there are times when you must do something or someone gets hurt, and so there's a, real crucible here for Esther. It's like, somebody's going to get hurt.
Oh, that's so good. I'm so glad to be having this conversation with you guys. I'm learning so much from listening to you. And Rosy, you've brought such a helpful perspective on this book. It has been such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for being our guest.
Thank you for having me. This has been such a great conversation. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, folks, if you liked what you heard this week, there is plenty more over at our website, firstreadingpodcast.com. We also post each episode on Facebook weekly, which gives you an easy way to share your favorite episodes with your friends, family, and grandma or preaching networks. If you have found First Reading helpful, please do take a minute to spread the word. Many thanks to Trinity Lutheran Seminary at Capital University for a grant that helps us sustain the podcast. Thanks also to Blue Dot Sessions for the music behind the reading. And thanks to you for listening. Until next time, I'm Dr. Rachel Wren.
And I'm Tim McNinch. Have a great week.